we told you that we are going to talk about Chris Hummer's top 100 list, true freshman impact top 100 list. And Drew, I love these lists. You do them all the time. You got the freak list, you got a bunch of other things, Dream Team, OT7 finals. But this was fun. I enjoyed this. So much of this is what I like is that we do the scouting on the front end of the high school. Chris kind of does the initial impressions of what these coaches kind of think spring wise, who are some of the guys standing out, who are some of the guys that might have to play early. So his is not so much through a scouting lens, but it's so much more through a sourcing lens, which I really like. And I think just my initial takeaway was, wow, the guys that showed up on this list, I feel pretty good about at least how we evaluated them coming out of high school.
It's like a report card, but like a week into the process, really. I mean, of these careers, if you kind of stretch them out. So yeah, I mean, some of them are always going to be a longer burn, but I don't know. I think me and you probably geek out more than anyone else when going through the list because we recognize every single name on there aside from like one or two. I thought the amount of 5 stars, 21 of our 32 5 stars from last cycle were mentioned by Hummer. Now, I don't know how much of an impact me personally, when I kind of saw some of those names, those guys are going to have. But it seems like a few of them could be, freshman All-Americans are going to be relied upon early on in the season.
Yeah, so I almost feel like it would be easier for us to start with the guys that weren't named, right? You talked about 21 of the 32 that were named. There's a significant amount of these guys that we expect to have potential impact as freshmen. What does that look like? All to varying degrees. The guys that weren't named, Drew, here they are. Jordan Ross to Tennessee, the 5-star edge rusher. Justin Williams, Chris Cole, the 2 backers at Georgia. Justin Scott at Miami. David Stone at Oklahoma. Don McKinley at LSU. Elijah Rushing, Gatlin Bear at Oregon. And Luke Reynolds at Penn State. Was there one or two names where you're like, Chris, I don't know. I think that guy's going to have to play early.
Well, let's see. Tennessee, Jordan Ross is kind of in a room that also includes James Pierce. Georgia, the linebackers, it's hard for them to play. David Stone at Oklahoma, that was one that jumped out to me because he had Jaden Jackson, David Stone's high school teammate, on there. Don McKinley, kind of the other at LSU. We've talked about them needing big bodies. I don't think me and you think he's ready to go day one, but they might not have a choice for him to be part of the rotation. I don't know. Anyone else jump out to you? Justin Scott at Miami, but then you think about the Hurricanes, how much they've invested in the trenches, more specifically so in the middle via the transfer portal. I don't know. All these guys, I think, just kind of circumstantial with where they are.
Yeah, I think you put it the correct way there in terms of circumstance. I think Jordan Ross steps into a great situation. A lot of that has to do with James Pierce. But Jordan Ross, we talk about these guys kind of uptick coming off of their senior seasons. That was Jordan Ross. I thought he was playing his best football second half of his senior year. He showed up Under Armour All-American game, continued to kind of show that he was trending in the right direction. He might kind of be at the right the right point of his kind of physical maturation where he should be able to give Tennessee some snaps, especially off the edge. I mean, yeah, James Pierce is a nightmare. He's going to create a lot of attention. But even if you got a guy right now who maybe still has to grow into what he's going to be in terms of playing the run, but can give you some snaps as an elite pass rusher, I think Jordan Ross should be able to play. I agree with you on the young backers. I think Georgia does a good job kind of getting those guys' feet wet, and then you start to see them more and more in the second half of the season. But I agree. That's kind of what happened with C.J. Allen. The 2 other ones, Drew, you make a great point. The 3 defensive linemen, I think all 3 of those dudes are going to play. Just how deep you have to be in the trenches. I think the other thing is, the game within the game. Can you afford to sit those dudes? Justin Scott, David Stone, Don McKinley, all 3 of those guys, at least in my mind, pretty sure all 3 of those guys got paid handsomely, right? So to keep those guys interested, to keep them in the boat, I think you got to find a way to get those guys reps. The one guy that I feel the best about is Don McKinley at LSU, because you said it. LSU is just kind of razor thin. Don McKinley might not be ready, but they need the body, so I think he's going to play.
I think what also stands out about those 3, all 3 of them look good in the all-star setting, right? Whether it be in San Antonio at the All-American Bowl or in Orlando at the Under Armour game. Like, I'm not saying they were the alphas every single day, but there were certainly flashes where you're like, okay, I think they are maybe a little ahead of the curve, might not be a huge adjustment when they get on campus. That's what I'll say. I mean, because sometimes we get kids in those all-star settings and it's like a deer in the headlight. It's like, whoa, all right, this is going to be, 1 or 2 developmental years. We still love the long-term outlook. I think I came out of there with Don McKinley, who has been described as like a timid individual. I didn't see any of that in Orlando. And then Justin Scott, he made it very difficult for the other team to practice at times.
Yeah, Don McKinley's interesting because we heard that going into that week, and then I guess when he, strapped up the helmet, it's a completely different beast. We saw a different guy than what had been described. The three other guys, Rushing, Bear, Luke Reynolds, can totally see it. I think all three of those guys, obviously Gatlin Bear going on the mission, Elijah Rushing's one of those guys going to need a year in the weight room. Luke Reynolds, kind of one of those guys as well. I could see him maybe a little situationally, but in a position that he can sit at Penn State and develop. All right, Drew, the good thing about this list that you can find on 247sports.com, shout out to our friend Chris Hummer, a lot of names here and a lot of guys that I think kind of get the mind going a little bit when you hear like the spring practice reports and this guy's turning heads and this guy did this. And for you and I, every day kind of seems like we're kind of drinking through a fire hose a little bit. So I don't know about you, but some of the names that kind of came up, I was like, whoa, I didn't know that this guy was, out there kind of making some noise during the spring. But maybe some names that kind of stood out to you that you had some connections to throughout the evaluation process.
Jaden Baugh, running back at Florida. We had him as an athlete, one-time Arkansas commit. I know some schools, I think Georgia had him on their linebacker board. Probably going to kick myself for not getting him a 4th star based on what we saw this spring, but I think he fits Billy Napier's offense, what they want to do. Kind of my player comp behind the scenes for Jaden Baugh has been Raheem Sanders, Rocket Sanders. I think there's a ton of similarities. Big back, has a top end gear, can pull away from defenses. Billy likes to use multiple ball carriers, committee type of role. I think Jaden Baugh is a name that will be on the field getting touches in 2024. So he was one that jumped out. 2 receivers for me, Cooper. Mario Craver at Mississippi State. I think this makes a ton of sense. There's been a ton of turnover, attrition there. Jeff Lebby coming in. They want to go wide open spread attack. I think he's the guy that can give you some snaps right away in the slot. And then finally, Ja'Cory Barney, another high 3-star for us out of South Florida, was a big win for the Cornhuskers. Finishes the high 89, highest a 3-star could be. Do we regret maybe not having that 4th star in him? Yeah, it's keeping me up at night right now because he looked really, really good in the Cornhuskers spring game. And Dylan Raiola, Ja'Cory Barney, I think that's a connection that you could hear over the next few years.
I could talk about this segment for maybe another half hour. I love it. I mean, there's so many names on there. We only kind of picked 3, but there are so many names that I was kind of fascinated by to see, like, all right, these guys really going to be able to make an impact early. For me, Drew, how about Ja'Shawn Ridgel, a guy that was committed to South Alabama, out of Alabama, was super fascinating to me, had a legit track and field background, played receiver, played safety, played quarterback, did a little bit of everything. And you'd watch him, and no disrespect to South Alabama. I mean, you got to give credit to Kane Womack at the time. But it was like, man, this just doesn't make sense. How has this guy not been unearthed? And I talked to the guys at Tulane, and they love Ja'Shawn Ridgel. They thought they were going to get him. Didn't happen. That staff ends up at Houston, and they pull the trigger, and they get him there. And you talk about Tulane, we talked about Tulane, Willie Fritz. Now that staff being over in Houston, I just love the job that they do. And I think this kid, physically ready to play, physically mature game, and then can help them out on teams too. The name to me that, was a little bit of a surprise. How about PJ Woodland at LSU, out of Mississippi? Saw him at Alabama, Mississippi. Really liked the kid, but he was like 165 pounds soaking wet when I saw him. So for me to hear that he was taking first team and second team reps during the spring was a little bit of surprise. And Drew, a good reminder that, circumstance, LSU in that secondary is kind of razor thin. That's a place that they got to get right under Corey Raymond, and help was on the way. But PJ Woodland's probably going to have to play this year, a guy that we had a high 3-star grade on. And then how about this one, man? Like I go back and forth. You mentioned Mario Craver. There was some like tight finishes deadline. Like, all right, we're gonna go 89, we're gonna go 90 here. Mario Craver was one of those guys. I pulled it off. I had him as 89. I saw him at Alabama, Mississippi. It was kind of like good lesson learned. I'm like, I can't live with it. I'm gonna stick it back on. Cameron Pruitt was one of those guys. We went into Alabama, Mississippi, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to see something here for this one to stick. Drew, I love this kid. Like hybrid safety, roll down guy, outside linebacker, will linebacker, can do a lot of different things. Kind of a seek and destroy type of player. I love this kid. I think Miami's got something here. He's going to need the weight room, but to hear that he was turning heads early, and I think Chris put in his article that this is the type of dude that they used to have in the early 2000s, it kind of fires me up because it's not just like a height, weight, speed thing. Like I love this guy's disposition, the way that he plays the game.
What did Hummer write on Rigel? Because I remember he was one of those quote unquote group of 5 commits we stamped as a 4th star right before the traditional national signing day. Got a ton of pushback on that exercise. But I remember me and you talking about him like just a jumbo mid skill, take him, figure it out later.
Yeah, I just think that that's what it is. Too dynamic of an athlete to kind of keep off the field. And if you're Willie Fritz, where more than likely it's going to be a year where you're just kind of like a foundational year, like let's build the culture. Why not give some of these talented freshmen run? And it's funny, like the group of 5 exercise. You don't want to like put yourself in a box and say, "Hey, we got to do this," but there's always going to be guys that transfer up. We've seen that, right? There are good players at the group of 5 level. So if we think that the guys got the goods, regardless of what team they're going to be suiting up for, then we owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves to grade them the way that we kind of see them with everybody else. So, Drew, any final thoughts on Hummer's articles? Any other takeaways there?
I think, the guys we mentioned, Ja'Cory Barney, Rigel, like if you play Devi, Devi leagues, like if you're in a Devi fantasy football, like names on that list, there's some hidden gems in there. And it's fun if you're a college football fan. I think Chris Hummer did an excellent job. And it's like you said, that he's working the college angle, the staffers. I mean, he came to me, I'm sure he came to you just for some kind of feedback on some names. But this is all coming from the other side, which means those individuals are going to play.
Did not come to me. So there you go. DOS priority, man. No, Hummer's great, does a phenomenal job. Obviously, extremely well read, extensive research, and all the feedback that he's gotten here. So make sure to check out his work on 247sports.com. And with that being said, 247sports.com is where you can find wall-to-wall team coverage, recruiting rankings, transfer portal updates, and the great work of Andrew Ivins, Chris Hummer, and the rest of our team here.